Hello, my dear friends. An empire that had stood for thousands of years collapsed not because of enemies from the north or constant internal turmoil, but because of a commodity that England secretly pushed in. Opium not only destroyed the body, but also destroyed the entire national spirit from within. While the court was still debating about etiquette, the people were lost in confusion, and foreign troops were gradually tightening their control. Tonight, let's explore how England used opium to destroy China's greatest empire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a person looked at the trade between Britain and China in the late 18th century, it might have seemed simple at first. Ships went east filled with silver, and they came back west loaded with tea, porcelain, and silk. The British people could not get enough of these goods, especially tea, which became a daily necessity rather than a luxury. But the silver that left Britain in exchange for tea became a problem. The empire was bleeding its reserves to pay for something it could not produce itself. From the perspective of British merchants and officials, this situation was unsustainable. They needed a product that China would want, something that could move in the opposite direction and bring silver back into British hands. The answer was not another luxury good, but a drug. Britain already controlled large territories in India, where the soil and climate were perfect for growing poppies. From these poppies came opium, a resin that had been used for centuries in medicine but which, when smoked, created a powerful habit. British authorities saw more than just a crop. They saw a weapon. They realized that if they could turn opium into a staple in China, it would become a permanent market. People would not only buy it once, they would keep buying it, again and again, until they could not stop. It was a soft weapon, carried not by soldiers but by merchants. The British East India Company organised the production with precision. Indian farmers were forced or persuaded to grow poppies under contracts that gave them little choice. Food crops gave way to fields of flowers whose resin was harvested and processed into bricks of opium. These were packed into chests, carried to ships, and sent on long voyages to the Chinese coast. Smugglers and middlemen ensured that the drug reached the hands of buyers. What appeared on the surface to be a trade in goods was in fact a carefully managed system, designed to undermine a nation from within. It almost feels like the kind of corporate strategy we might see today when a company hooks people on a product and calls it innovation. At first, the Qing government did not fully grasp the scale of what was happening. Opium was not unknown in China, but its use had been limited. A few wealthy households had used it as medicine, and some coastal merchants had dabbled in the trade. It was not seen as a major issue. Officials were more concerned with piracy, tax collection, and keeping local order. The new surge of imports went unnoticed by many in authority, partly because corruption was already a problem. Bribes ensured that shipments passed through without interference. Some officials themselves began using opium, which made them even less likely to act. The economic impact grew steadily. Silver began to flow out of China in exchange for opium, reversing the earlier trade pattern. What had once been a proud surplus in silver turned into a deficit. The treasury felt the strain. Farmers who sold their grain to buy opium stopped investing in their fields. Merchants who once dealt in cloth or tools now found that their best profits came from drug trading. Slowly, the structure of the economy began to shift. Dependence on opium became widespread, and with it came dependence on foreign suppliers. This was the heart of the British strategy. They did not need to march armies across the land to weaken China. They could let the drug do the work for them. Every pipe smoked in a village. Every coin of silver handed over to a smuggler chipped away at the strength of the Qing state. The addiction spread not only among commoners, but also among scholars, merchants, and even soldiers. It reached into the bureaucracy and the military, dulling the very institutions that were supposed to protect the empire. Looking back, it is clear that this was not an accident. It was an intentional form of economic warfare. The British knew they were violating Chinese law. They knew the trade was destructive, yet they justified it by pointing to profit and the balance of trade. I cannot help but think that if I had been alive then, living in a port city and seeing these ships arrive, I might not have recognised that what looked like trade was in fact a slow invasion. The British called it commerce, but in practice it was a campaign. They used their control over India to ensure a steady supply. They used their naval power to protect shipping lanes. They used bribes to smooth over obstacles, and they relied on the very nature of addiction to ensure that once the market began, it would never end. Unlike tea, silk, or porcelain, opium created its own demand. People who began smoking it quickly found that they needed more. That needs guaranteed future profits for Britain and future weakness for China. In this early stage, before open conflict, the most striking feature is how invisible the attack was. There were no cannon blasts, no burning cities, no captured forts. Instead, there were rooms filled with smoke, bodies lying in stupor, and silver coins vanishing from the economy. The damage accumulated quietly but relentlessly. This is why historians later called it a soft weapon. It was soft in appearance, but its impact was as sharp as any blade. It is almost ironic that while Britain built ships with iron and cannons with steel, its most effective tool against China was a powder pressed from a flower. The Qing dynasty still believed itself secure. The emperor and his court continued their rituals and ceremonies. The bureaucracy maintained its exams and its paperwork. The military paraded in traditional drills. Yet underneath, the empire was being hollowed out. A state can survive external enemies if it has internal strength, but when the inside begins to rot, the walls can no longer stand. Opium created that rot, and Britain ensured that it spread as widely as possible. The stage was set for greater conflicts that would soon follow. What began as a trade imbalance had turned into a deliberate strategy of weakening an empire. Ships carrying tea and porcelain out of China were now matched by ships carrying opium into it. The silver that once filled Chinese coffers now poured out to pay for foreign poison. The empire's leaders were slow to see that this was not merely smuggling but a form of conquest. They would realise it only when it was too late, when the habit had sunk deep and the power to resist had slipped away. The soft weapon was already doing its work, and the empire that had once looked unshakable was beginning to lean under its weight. This quiet assault would soon bring visible cracks, as social, economic, and military systems all began to strain against the pressure. The first signs of collapse were already in motion, even if few wanted to admit it at the time. The early spread of opium across China was not hidden in dark alleys or limited to secret dens. It began openly among the people who had the most power, wealth, and influence, in palaces, mansions, and the private chambers of the elite. Pipes were lit as though they were part of polite entertainment. The drug was not yet seen as a poison, but as a marker of refinement. Nobles and merchants, eager to display their status, used opium as a symbol. A guest at a wealthy man's home might be offered tea, sweet cakes, and eventually a pipe of opium, as though it were a gesture of sophistication. What started as a luxury quickly became a fashionable pastime, and from there it grew into something more dangerous. It is almost comical that what they called elegance was really the act of poisoning themselves in velvet robes. Merchants who had gained fortunes from trade with foreign ships were among the first to embrace the habit. For them, opium was both a product and a pleasure. They used the profits from selling goods to foreigners to purchase opium in return, and then they consumed it themselves. The smoke drifting through merchant houses was more than a personal indulgence. It was also a signal to their peers that they were connected to global trade and able to afford what others could not. In a society where appearances mattered, opium became part of a performance. It marked the difference between the common labourer in the fields and the wealthy man who could recline with a pipe at his leisure. The impact on the Qing officials was equally serious. Many officials turned their eyes away from the growing trade, not because they failed to see it, but because they were paid not to interfere. Smugglers and foreign traders understood that the easiest way to move goods was to place silver in the hands of gatekeepers. Once the habit reached those officials themselves, the problem deepened. When an official who was supposed to enforce the ban was also an opium user, his interest in doing his duty faded. The administration became compromised, not by direct battle, but by quiet corruption and weakness. It feels like watching a system rot from the top. In the same way, modern institutions sometimes fail when those in charge benefit from the very problem they should stop. The result was that the Qing dynasty did not react quickly. Orders were issued occasionally, forbidding opium or warning of its dangers, but they were not enforced with seriousness. The words on paper meant little when the men signing them had smoke in their lungs. Across the empire, the drug was spreading. From the coast, it moved inland, carried along rivers, roads, and caravans. The wealthy smoked in their halls, the merchants in their shops, and soon ordinary townsmen began to copy them. The delay in response meant that by the time the danger was fully recognized, it had already become a part of social life. The social impact was visible in gatherings. Banquets that once focused on food, wine, and poetry readings began to include sessions of smoking. The act of sharing a pipe became as common as pouring wine into a guest cup. To refuse it might even have been seen as unfashionable. People did not see themselves as addicts. They believed they were participating in a cultured practice, one that signalled modernity and cosmopolitan taste. The slow damage to their bodies and minds was ignored or hidden behind layers of etiquette. In the countryside, the example of the elite carried influence. Villagers who saw merchants or local leaders indulging in opium assumed that it must be safe, even respectable. The pipe was not associated with shame, but with progress. Farmers began trading their crops for small amounts of opium, curious to try what the higher classes were praising. What started as an experiment often became a daily need. The cycle spread outward, pushed by the twin forces of fashion and profit. The absence of a strong response from the government created a dangerous illusion. People believed that if the emperor and his officials truly disapproved, they would act. Since there was little visible action, many assumed the practice was acceptable. Laws against opium were written, but they were undermined by bribes and ignored by those in power. The empire appeared stable, but inside it was losing control. I find it hard not to think that if I had been alive at that time, seeing how lightly officials treated the matter, I too might have assumed that it was nothing serious. The more time passed, the harder it became to intervene. Addiction was not only personal but also structural. Merchants depended on profits, officials relied on bribes, and users craved their daily smoke. To cut off the supply would have meant disrupting multiple layers of society. By failing to act quickly, the dynasty allowed the drug to weave itself into the economy, the bureaucracy, and the culture. The initial stage, when it might have been stopped, passed without decisive effort. Meanwhile, foreign traders observed with satisfaction. The British plan was working. Opium was no longer just a product. It was becoming a necessity for an entire population. Each shipload brought more silver into foreign hands and left more weakness behind in China. The luxury of the elite had transformed into dependence, and the government had done little to stop it. What makes this stage particularly tragic is that the signs were visible. People could see relatives becoming thinner, weaker, and less productive. They could see officials neglecting their duties. They could see families spending money on smoke instead of food. But these warnings were ignored or dismissed as isolated cases. The belief that the empire was too strong to be shaken blinded many to the reality. The early indulgence of nobles and merchants, the corruption of officials, and the slow reaction of the state created a perfect environment for the problem to grow. What began as a fashionable amusement turned into a national weakness. By the time the dynasty understood the scale of the crisis, The habit had spread so deeply that it was no longer just a personal vice. It was a social epidemic. The seeds of collapse were planted not only by foreign merchants, but also by the complacency of those who should have protected the empire. The failure to act at the start allowed opium to become woven into daily life, making later efforts at control almost impossible. The empire stood proud on the outside, but inside the smoke was already spreading through its halls and homes. The silence of the government and the complicity of its elite gave the illusion of normalcy, but underneath, society was already shifting. The stage was now set for the effects to reach ordinary people more widely, eroding not just the luxury of nobles, but the survival of farmers, women, and children who had no power to resist what was coming. When the smoke of opium spread beyond the mansions and merchant houses, it reached the villages and the homes of the ordinary people. This was when the damage became impossible to ignore. Farmers, who had long been the backbone of the Chinese Empire, began to weaken under the influence of the drug. A man who once spent his days tending rice paddies or working in the fields could no longer summon the strength. Muscles that had once been trained for labour became slack, and his energy drained away. Instead of walking to the fields at dawn, many stayed inside, lying next to their pipes. The land was still there, the soil still fertile, but the hands that should have cared for it were idle. In a society where survival depended on constant work, the sudden absence of effort created a visible decline. Crops went untended, irrigation systems broke down, and entire regions began to suffer food shortages. It is almost bitterly amusing to think that one tiny pipe could destroy acres of farmland more efficiently than any invading army. The decline in men's health and willpower had consequences for families. Women who had traditionally supported the household became the only ones left to keep it functioning. Wives, mothers, and daughters found themselves carrying burdens they were never meant to bear alone. Some rose to the challenge, managing farms, selling goods in markets, or finding other ways to feed their families. Others faced desperation. Husbands who were consumed by addiction sometimes sold their wives or daughters to pay for more opium. In cities, women ended up in servitude or worse, not because of their own choices, but because their households had collapsed under the weight of addiction. Families that had once been stable crumbled, not through war or famine, but through the steady grip of smoke that dulled ambition and destroyed responsibility. Children were caught in this downward spiral. When fathers no longer worked and mothers were forced into impossible situations, children became the substitute labour force. Young boys who should have been learning skills or studying for exams were sent to work in the fields or carry loads in towns. The weight of adult responsibility fell on their small shoulders, shaping lives of hardship before they had even reached maturity. Worse still, some children were introduced to opium directly. Parents, overwhelmed or addicted themselves, sometimes gave their children small doses to quiet their hunger or keep them still. What began as an imitation of adult habits turned into early addiction. Small bodies suffered the same weakness, the same loss of will, and the same decline. A generation was being raised not with hope, but with dependence. The effects spread through communities in patterns that were easy to see, but hard to stop. A single household might fall into ruin, leaving neighbours to pick up the pieces, but when entire villages faced the same problem, there was no one left to offer help. The rhythm of daily life slowed. Harvest festivals became thinner, markets became emptier, and the energy of local gatherings faded. What had once been vibrant communities filled with labour, trade, and family life were now dotted with houses where smoke curled lazily from within, marking places where the will to work and to live had been consumed. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like entire neighbourhoods where every family had a bottle of strong narcotics in the kitchen, treated as casually as sugar or salt. The government's failure to act only deepened the misery. Families who sought relief found none. Officials who might have stepped in to prevent the spread were themselves compromised. Tax collectors still demanded payment, but when farmers had abandoned their fields, there was no income to provide. The result was a vicious cycle. Fields left untended led to shortages. Shortages led to higher prices. Higher prices pushed families further into poverty, and poverty made the lure of opium even stronger. What had started as a problem of the elite became a trap for the masses. For women, the transformation of roles was stark. They were expected to keep households alive, even as the men who should have supported them wasted away. Some women became resourceful, finding ways to stretch what little food remained or managing the sale of small goods. But others fell into despair, abandoned by husbands who preferred smoke to duty. Stories of women being sold or traded were not rare. The desperation of addiction turned human relationships into transactions, stripping away dignity and security. I cannot help but feel that in such an environment, even the strongest bonds of family could be broken with frightening ease. The effect on children left scars that would last for decades. Not only did they lose the protection of stable homes, but many also lost the chance for education. Schools already struggled under shortages of teachers, and when children were forced to work or fell into addiction themselves, the hope of a better future disappeared. A society without strong children cannot imagine strong adults, and the empire was building a generation weakened before it even had a chance to grow. The spread of opium among ordinary people also had visible consequences in public order. Petty thefts increased as addicts sought money for more smoke. Violence in villages became more common, not from rebellion but from disputes between families falling apart under the strain. Markets shrank, farms emptied, and the stability that had once defined rural China began to fade. Where once the strength of the people had been the empire's greatest asset, now their weakness became its greatest vulnerability. Foreign traders profited at every step. Each chest of opium sold was more silver taken from the hands of the people and from the coffers of the state. The economic drain was matched by a human drain, as energy, productivity, and hope vanished. For the British, this meant success. For China, it meant decay that reached from the highest courts down to the humblest huts. The collapse of ordinary life showed how far the damage had spread. Nobles might indulge in opium for luxury. Officials might tolerate it for bribes. But when farmers abandoned their fields, when women were forced into desperate roles, and when children lost both childhood and future, the cost was unmistakable. It was not just a drug problem. It was a social catastrophe. By the time the Qing leaders began to take the issue seriously, the ordinary people had already paid the price. Their strength, their families, and their futures were eroded. What was left was a population drained in body and spirit, unable to provide the foundation that any empire requires to endure. The empire could not survive on ceremonies and officials alone. It needed its farmers, its women, its children, and its workers. With them weakened by opium, the empire itself stood on crumbling ground. The smoke that drifted through households was not just a private matter. It was the visible sign of a nation unravelling from within. The suffering of ordinary people revealed that opium was not only a luxury or a corruption, but a force capable of undoing the very heart of society. With the base collapsing, the higher levels of the empire would soon follow into the same decline. The decline of ordinary families did not stop at the walls of their homes. It soon reached the very core of China's economy, which had long rested on the strength of agriculture. Vast river valleys that once supplied rice, wheat, and millet began to change. These lands, fertile and carefully managed for centuries, relied on the constant work of farmers who understood the flow of water and the rhythm of the seasons. When opium addiction spread among those same farmers, the daily labour that kept the land alive was interrupted. A man who could once carry water to irrigate fields now stays indoors, lost in smoke. A family that once rose before sunrise to plant and weed now neglects the soil. Entire stretches of farmland fell silent. The rivers still flowed, the sun still shone, but the fields were left empty, yields dropped, and hunger became more common. It is strikingly absurd that after centuries of surviving floods and droughts, China's fields were finally undone by the voluntary weakness of the very people who lived on them. The collapse of agriculture did not only mean fewer harvests, it also meant the loss of the local economy that surrounded farming. Markets that once bustled with grain sellers, millers, and traders grew quiet. Villagers who had always exchanged goods on market days found fewer things to buy or sell. The countryside became poorer, and with it the empire itself. Grain prices rose, and poor families who had once managed to get by now struggled with hunger. For a state that depended on stable food supplies to feed its population and its armies, this was a silent but devastating shift. Handicraft traditions, which had long added to the wealth of rural and urban China, also began to decline. Weavers, potters, carpenters, and other skilled workers required patience, practice, and steady hands. But when addiction entered their lives, their skills began to fade, a potter too weak to shape clay, a weaver distracted by cravings, or a carpenter unable to focus on his work all produced goods of lower quality or none at all. Workshops that had been passed from father to son for generations fell apart. Artisans who had once been proud of their craft became dependent on a substance that drained their talent away. If we think about it today, it would be like seeing entire industries of designers, builders, and engineers abandoning their skills to chase after a bottle of narcotics sold on every street corner. The decline of handicrafts had broader consequences. China had long been admired for the quality of its silk, porcelain, and lacquerware. These were not only sources of pride but also of trade. As artisans faltered, foreign imports began to replace local products. Shops that had once displayed fine Chinese goods now stocked foreign-made items. Dependence on external trade deepened, while domestic traditions weakened. The very image of Chinese culture, expressed through its crafts, was slowly eroded by smoke that dulled the hands and minds of its artisans. The internal market suffered as both agriculture and handicrafts declined. Rural areas no longer produced surpluses to sell. Urban markets lost their supply of goods. Trade routes that had once carried rice, silk, and pottery now carried opium instead. Silver that should have circulated within the domestic economy poured out to foreign merchants. This shift made China vulnerable not only to hunger and poverty, but also to foreign dominance. The more the people relied on foreign goods, the less control the empire had over its own survival. In regions along major rivers, the impact was especially visible. Fields along the Yangtze and the Yellow River, once the pride of the empire, began to show signs of neglect. Irrigation channels clogged, dikes crumbled, and harvests shrank. These were not sudden disasters caused by floods or storms, but slow, human-made declines caused by the absence of labour. The empire's leaders had long celebrated the rivers as symbols of abundance. Now they were reminders of weakness, flowing past lands that were no longer cared for. The loss of agriculture and crafts also weakened social stability. When families could not farm or produce goods, they turned to desperate measures. Theft increased, debt mounted, and more people fell into the grip of opium as a form of escape. What should have been a cycle of production and trade turned into a cycle of poverty and dependence. Officials demanded taxes that could not be paid, merchants demanded goods that could not be delivered, and the people turned increasingly toward foreign products that drained the country of its wealth. For the empire itself, the decline meant reduced revenue. Taxes on land and trade had been the foundation of government income. As farms were abandoned and markets shrank, the state collected less. Yet the costs of administration, the army, and the imperial court remained. The imbalance pushed the government to borrow, to raise taxes where it could, and to depend even more heavily on a system that was already failing. The economic structure that had endured for centuries began to collapse under pressure from within. I cannot help but feel that this stage of decline must have seemed both invisible and unstoppable, as though everyone saw it happening but no one could change its course. The combination of failing farms, ruined artisans, and shrinking markets revealed how deeply opium had penetrated society. It was no longer just a personal vice or a household problem. It had become an economic poison. The empire could not function without food, crafts, and trade. Yet all three were crumbling. The silver that once supported commerce was gone, and the products that once defined China's wealth were disappearing. The tragedy was not only the loss of material goods, but also the loss of identity. China had long been proud of its ability to feed its people and to produce beautiful, durable crafts admired around the world. When those strengths faded, so too did the confidence of its people and the respect of other nations. The empire, once called the Middle Kingdom, looked less like the centre of the world and more like a weakening state dependent on outsiders. As agriculture declined, handicrafts faltered, and the market collapsed, the empire stood on increasingly fragile ground. The countryside was no longer the strong base it had been, and the towns and cities no longer thrived as centres of trade. The economy that had once been vast and self-sufficient now leaned dangerously on foreign goods and foreign silver. The visible signs of decline in fields, workshops, and markets were warnings of a deeper collapse. They showed that the foundations of the empire were breaking apart. From there, the weakness would spread upward, reaching into the very institutions of government that depended on the strength of its economy. The spread of opium did not stop at the level of farmers, artisans, or merchants. It climbed steadily upward into the very heart of the Qing administration, the bureaucracy that had once been considered one of the most sophisticated in the world. This system, based on examinations, Confucian values, and long traditions of centralized power, began to weaken from within. Officials who had been trusted to enforce the law and guide the empire instead became entangled in corruption and addiction. The impact was subtle at first, but soon it became obvious that the machinery of government was slowing down, losing its ability to function as intended. One of the earliest changes was in the role of gifts and bribes. In the past, officials were often offered silver, land, or favours to look the other way. With the rise of opium, the substance itself became a new form of payment. Merchants and smugglers who wished to continue their trade did not always need to hand over large amounts of money. Instead, they gave officials the very product that was causing the problem. The officials accepted it, not only for personal use but also as a currency they could pass along to others. The drug became both a commodity and a token of influence, slipping quietly through the networks of power. It is almost laughable to think of a government where bribes were not just coins or jewels, but pipes filled with smoke, exchanged like a twisted version of hospitality. As more officials indulged, their ability to perform their duties declined. Judicial cases that required careful thought and judgment were delayed for weeks or months. An official too clouded by addiction might postpone hearings, ignore petitions, or hand down decisions without proper review. Families waiting for justice found themselves stalled, their cases buried under the lethargy of an administration that no longer had clear minds at its helm. The bureaucracy that had once prided itself on rigorous standards and learned men was now filled with figures who were distracted, weakened, or uninterested in their work. The deterioration extended into the larger machinery of the state. Imperial edicts still flowed outward from the capital, written in precise calligraphy and carrying the seal of the throne. But in the provinces, where they were supposed to be enacted, the response was sluggish. Governors and magistrates read them, nodded, and then returned to their pipes. Reports back to the capital were delayed or falsified, hiding the extent of the decline. What had once been a system admired for its structure was now burdened by inefficiency and dishonesty. If we compared it to modern times, it would be like having an entire government distracted by constant intoxication, unable to make decisions while crises piled up in every corner. The problem was not only the individual weakness of officials, but also the culture that developed around it. When a magistrate or governor openly indulged in opium, it signalled to subordinates that such behaviour was acceptable. Lower-level clerks followed the example until entire offices were compromised. Work that should have been done in days took months. Tax records went missing. Court decisions were left unsigned. Local disputes that needed intervention were ignored until they grew into larger conflicts. The state's promise of order and fairness eroded, leaving people disillusioned. For ordinary citizens, this failure of the bureaucracy was devastating. They had always relied on officials to mediate disputes, to manage taxes, and to ensure some degree of justice. When those officials failed, people were left with little recourse. Many turned instead to local power holders, wealthy families, or even criminal groups who could enforce order where the state no longer did. This shift weakened the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. Trust in the imperial system declined, replaced by frustration and resentment. At the highest levels, even the emperor's authority was diminished. Court officials who advised him were not immune to the influence of opium. Their decisions were clouded, their energy drained. Discussions that should have centered on reform and defense instead drifted into routine rituals. The emperor, isolated within the palace, received reports that did not reflect the true scale of the crisis. Without accurate information, his decrees became detached from reality. The great machine of centralized power, once able to command millions across vast territories, now stumbled over its own weakness. The loss of bureaucratic efficiency also had practical consequences for the military and the economy. Tax revenues that were supposed to support armies and infrastructure were delayed or stolen. Recruitment records were falsified. Supplies for soldiers never arrived. Bridges and roads that needed repair were neglected. Each administrative failure compounded the others, creating a chain reaction of decline. The government that should have been the backbone of the empire became its liability. The moral authority of the Confucian system also suffered. For centuries, the examination system had been seen as a way to ensure that men of learning and virtue rose to positions of responsibility. But when even those men succumbed to addiction or corruption, the ideal was shattered. Students preparing for exams saw their role models indulging in opium. Citizens who were taught to respect officials saw those same officials stumbling in public or neglecting their duties. The erosion of moral authority was as damaging as the erosion of efficiency. Over time, the dysfunction became normal. People no longer expected quick justice or honest administration. They assumed that officials would be slow, distracted, and corrupt. Bribes were considered a necessity rather than a crime. Petitioners learned that without gifts of opium or silver, their cases would never be heard. The culture of governance had shifted from one of order to one of decay, and the people adjusted by lowering their expectations. I cannot help but imagine that living under such a system must have felt like shouting into an empty room, knowing that no answer would ever come back. The weakening of the bureaucracy showed that the damage of opium was not limited to the body or the household. It had reached into the very structure of the state. With officials compromised and the machinery of government clogged, the empire lost its ability to respond to crises. The great administrative system that had once been China's pride was now a burden, dragging the nation further into decline. As the bureaucracy faltered, the effects rippled outward. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, and families all suffered from the failures of the state. The empire was no longer guided by strong hands, but by hands weakened by smoke. What had once been a structure of power and order had become fragile, leaving the nation exposed to dangers both internal and external. The hollowing out of the bureaucracy was not the final stage of decline, but a step that prepared the way for greater disasters. Once the administration could no longer protect the people or the state, the empire was left vulnerable. The signs of collapse were now visible not only in homes and fields, but also in the very offices where the empire was supposed to be governed. The weakness that had hollowed out the homes, the fields, and the bureaucracy did not stop there. It reached into the armies of the Qing dynasty, the very institution that was supposed to defend the empire from foreign invasion and internal rebellion. For centuries, China's military had been a symbol of imperial authority. Soldiers guarded borders, patrolled trade routes, and marched under banners that represented the throne. But as opium spread, The discipline and strength of those soldiers declined. Men who once trained with weapons and drilled in formations began to spend more time with pipes than with swords. Their reflexes slowed, their bodies weakened, and their will to fight was drained. It is almost darkly comic to picture an army where soldiers carried pipes as faithfully as they carried spears, expecting smoke to protect them from bullets. The addiction was not confined to a few individuals, it seeped into entire regiments. In barracks where men should have been sharpening skills and building endurance, opium became the shared habit. Pipes and lamps replaced drills, and the atmosphere of discipline turned into one of lethargy. Officers who should have enforced order often shared in the same weakness, allowing the problem to spread unchecked. The very places meant to project strength became gathering spots for indulgence. Instead of the sounds of marching feet and clashing weapons, there was the quiet of soldiers lying still, their minds clouded by smoke. This loss of discipline showed itself in small ways that soon grew larger. Weapons were neglected, uniforms went unkempt, and training exercises were abandoned. Soldiers who had once been alert on patrols now stood distracted, slow to notice danger. Drills that should have built unity turned into half-hearted gestures, performed without energy. When a group of men is bound more by a shared addiction than by shared duty, it can no longer function as a fighting force. The weakness of the army was not a secret. Local communities saw it when troops passed through their towns. Instead of inspiring respect, soldiers inspired ridicule or pity. Families who once trusted the military to provide protection began to doubt its value. Even rebels and bandits saw opportunities, recognizing that the once feared soldiers of the empire no longer posed the same threat. The image of power had faded, and with it the ability to deter enemies. If we look at it in today's terms, it would be like discovering that a modern army had more men hooked on drugs than trained for combat, a force more likely to collapse from its own weakness than to stand against a real enemy. The decay extended into logistics and organization. Supplies meant for armies were often stolen or traded for opium. Food, weapons, and uniforms disappeared, replaced by crates of the drug. Recruitment suffered as well. Young men who might have joined the army were already weakened by addiction before they ever held a weapon. The pool of potential soldiers shrank, and those who did enlist brought the problem with them. Instead of a strong, fresh generation, the military absorbed the same sickness that had spread across society. When battles did come, the results were predictable. Soldiers who had lost their strength and discipline could not endure the stress of combat. Units broke apart quickly, men fled from the field, and leaders struggled to maintain control. Even when numbers were large, effectiveness was low. The appearance of a great army on paper hid the reality of a force too weak to resist determined enemies. Foreign troops, trained and disciplined, faced little opposition from men who were more accustomed to smoke-filled barracks than to the demands of battle. The collapse of military power revealed the depth of the crisis. An empire can survive economic hardship or even corruption if its armies remain strong. But when the soldiers themselves are compromised, the entire structure of the state is exposed. The Qing dynasty had long relied on the idea that its banners and armies represented unshakable strength. By the 19th century, that strength was hollow. The banners still flew, but the men beneath them no longer had the power to defend them. The decline of the army also undermined loyalty and morale. Soldiers who were addicted cared less for duty and more for the next chance to smoke. The bonds of camaraderie, once forged in shared hardship and discipline, dissolved. Mutinies, desertions, and disobedience became more common. Leaders who tried to enforce strict rules were often undermined by their own habits or by the sheer number of men unwilling to follow. The culture of the military shifted from pride to indifference. For the empire, this was one of the most dangerous consequences of opium. Without a strong army, borders could not be defended, rebellions could not be suppressed, and foreign powers could not be resisted. The hollow state of the military meant that when crises came, The empire had nothing solid to rely upon. Battles that might once have been won with discipline and courage were lost to weakness and disarray. The erosion of military power was not sudden. It was a slow decline, masked by rituals, parades, and the illusion of order, but beneath the surface the core was rotten. By the time foreign powers confronted the Qing dynasty, the damage was already done. The soldiers who marched to defend their empire were already defeated by the smoke that had long since filled their lungs. I cannot escape the thought that an empire with millions of people and centuries of military tradition was undone not by superior weapons alone, but by its own inability to keep its soldiers from falling into a haze. The empire could still display banners, hold reviews, and issue proclamations of strength. But when the time came to fight, the truth emerged. The army collapsed quickly, unable to withstand the pressure of real combat. The stage was set for humiliating defeats that would reveal to the world just how deeply opium had stripped the empire of its defences. The decline of the Qing dynasty was never confined to households or even the army. It reached into the treasury itself, draining the lifeblood of the state. China had long measured its wealth in silver, a precious metal that flowed steadily into the empire through trade in tea, silk, and porcelain. For centuries, this balance gave the dynasty confidence that its coffers would remain full, but with the rise of opium, the flow of silver reversed. Families who once used their coins to pay taxes or invest in land now spent them on imported smoke. Chest after chest of silver left the country in exchange for the drug, while almost nothing came back in return. The empire, which had once prided itself on self-sufficiency and abundance, found itself bleeding wealth. It is almost laughable to think that a great empire could be bankrupted not by armies at its gates, but by people handing silver coins to smugglers in back alleys. The collapse of silver reserves was not a distant problem that only officials noticed. It touched every level of society. Farmers who needed silver to pay taxes found it harder to come by. Merchants who once used silver to buy goods now struggled with rising prices. Even the wealthy elite, who had once flaunted their opium pipes as a symbol of luxury, began to realize that their silver was disappearing faster than it could be replaced. The drain was relentless. For every pipe lit in a village, another coin vanished from the treasury's reach. The state felt the pressure most severely. The imperial treasury, which had once collected steady revenues from land and trade, began to shrink. With less silver available in circulation, taxes were harder to collect. Families hoarded what little they had, or they had already spent it on opium. The government, desperate for funds, faced the grim reality that it could no longer meet its obligations. Salaries for officials were delayed. Payments to soldiers became irregular. Supplies for infrastructure and defence were left unfunded. A state that cannot pay its servants or its soldiers soon loses its loyalty. The weakness spread upward, threatening the very stability of the throne. The need for funds led to desperate measures. Officials turned to higher taxes, hoping to squeeze more silver from the population. But this strategy backfired. Ordinary families, already weakened by addiction and poverty, could not meet the new demands. The burden fell hardest on those least able to bear it. Farmers sold tools, land, and even family members in attempts to pay. Merchants closed shops rather than face bankruptcy from impossible tax rates. Instead of restoring stability, higher taxes deepened misery. Resentment grew, and with it unrest. If we looked at it today, it would be like a government raising taxes during a severe recession, expecting prosperity to return when, in fact, it only fuels more collapse. The financial collapse also eroded the empire's ability to defend itself. Weapons and ammunition, once purchased with steady silver reserves, became scarce. Fortresses that needed repairs were left crumbling. Naval fleets that required investment were neglected. The empire stood increasingly defenceless, not because it lacked men or resources in theory, but because its treasury was empty. An army without pay, without supplies, and without leadership cannot fight effectively. The weakness of the state's finances translated directly into vulnerability on the battlefield. Beyond the practical loss of money, there was also a psychological cost. The empire had always projected itself as wealthy and stable. Its rulers claimed the mandate of heaven, which was tied not only to moral authority but also to prosperity. When silver reserves dwindled, when officials went unpaid, when soldiers lacked supplies, the illusion of divine favour weakened. People began to question whether their rulers still had the mandate to govern. Faith in the dynasty was as much a currency as silver, and both were disappearing. Smugglers and foreign traders thrived in this environment. For them, the silver drain was profit. Each shipment of opium brought more coins out of China and into foreign banks. The more desperate the population became, the more demand grew. It was a vicious cycle. Addiction created demand. Demand drained silver, and the lack of silver weakened the state, which then had less power to stop the trade. Foreign merchants saw success where the empire saw ruin. The government's attempts to regulate the crisis were half-hearted and often corrupt. Some officials tried to enforce bans on opium, but they were easily bribed. Others focused on raising revenue through new taxes or levies, but these measures angered the population without solving the underlying problem. The lack of a coordinated response meant that the treasury continued to shrink, while resentment against the state grew. For ordinary people, the financial collapse meant constant insecurity. Taxes could rise without warning. Officials might demand payments in advance or invent new fees. Farmers who once survived on modest harvests now faced the dual pressure of addiction in their families and crushing demands from the state. Markets that once provided stability turned chaotic as prices rose and silver grew scarce. Poverty deepened, and the sense of despair spread. The empire's financial decline showed clearly how deeply opium had penetrated its structures. It was not only the poor who suffered, nor only the addicted. The very machinery of the state was being drained of its lifeblood. Without silver, the government could not function. Without a function, it could not govern. The drain of silver was more than an economic problem. It was a sign of a collapsing system, unable to sustain itself against both internal weakness and external pressure. I cannot help but think that a treasury collapsing under the weight of smoke is one of the clearest signs of how a nation can die without a single battle. By the time the state recognized the depth of the crisis, the damage was already done. The reserves that had once supported armies, officials, and infrastructure were gone. Attempts to restore them through taxation only created more instability. The empire stood weakened, exposed, and unable to defend itself financially or militarily. The collapse of the treasury was not an isolated event. It was tied to the failures of agriculture, the decay of the bureaucracy, and the weakness of the army. Together, these created a cycle of decline that the dynasty could not escape. As silver continued to pour out of the country, the empire was left not with prosperity, but with smoke, poverty, and instability. The drain of silver from the treasury was one of the most visible signs that the empire's foundation was breaking apart. What had once been a proud and wealthy state was now struggling to pay its own servants. The weakness that began in private homes had now reached the very heart of the dynasty's power. The Qing dynasty had long claimed to be the guardian of stability and tradition, but by the 19th century, the need for reform was becoming urgent. Pressures from foreign powers, internal unrest, and the decay of daily life all demanded new solutions. Efforts at self-strengthening were proposed, aiming to modernize the military, reform the administration, and revive the economy. Yet these efforts faced an enemy more insidious than foreign cannons or rebellious armies. Opium, already woven deeply into the fabric of society, made reform nearly impossible. The very people who were supposed to lead renewal were often the same people lost in smoke. Their minds dulled and their bodies weakened. It is almost absurd to imagine ministers planning modernization while pausing to take a pipe, believing they could strengthen the empire with one hand while destroying themselves with the other. The weakness of human resources was one of the greatest obstacles. Reforms require energy, clear thought, and determined leaders. But when officials, scholars, and even military officers were consumed by addiction, the talent pool was drained. Men who might have designed new schools or written policies for industry were instead clouded by opium. Ambitious programs were proposed, but they were drafted by tired minds, debated by distracted officials, and carried out by weakened administrators. The very capacity to think of the future was eroded by a substance that encouraged only retreat into haze. Among the educated elite, the problem was especially severe. These men had been trained to memorize the classics, debate philosophy, and serve as guides for the state. But opium crept into their circles, dulling their brilliance. The very people who should have been the engine of reform became part of the resistance to it, not because they opposed progress in principle, but because they lacked the will to push it forward. Universities and academies lost some of their brightest minds. Examinations, which had once been gateways to service, became arenas where candidates arrived weakened, distracted, or already addicted. Instead of renewing the bureaucracy with vigour, the system replenished itself with men already compromised. Finances also played a decisive role in blocking reform. Ambitious plans for modern armies, new shipyards, or improved infrastructure all required money. But the treasury, already drained by opium and weakened by corruption, had little to offer. What funds existed were often diverted to cover immediate crises, such as paying soldiers or supplying the court. The idea of investing in schools, factories, or modern weapons became secondary. Reform requires stability, yet the empire was constantly scrambling to fill holes left by its own weakness. If we compared it to a modern state, it would be like trying to build high-speed rail while the government cannot even pay the electricity bills. The little money that was spent on reform often disappeared through corruption. Officials entrusted with funds used them for personal gain or simply lost them in a haze of addiction. Projects that began with grand announcements ended with half-finished buildings, poorly equipped arsenals, or ineffective training programs. Foreign observers noted the gap between the empire's promises and its achievements. On paper, the Qing looked as if it was responding to the crisis. In reality, the reforms were hollow, blocked by the very substance that had already weakened homes, farms, armies, and treasuries. The social foundation necessary for reform was also missing. An empire depends on its people to carry out change. Farmers must grow food, artisans must produce goods, and soldiers must train and fight. But with so much of the population affected by addiction, the energy to support reform simply did not exist. Even if the leadership had found the vision and the money, they lacked the healthy, productive citizens needed to carry out the plans. The result was stagnation disguised as progress. For ordinary citizens, the talk of reform sounded distant and irrelevant. They continued to face the same burdens of addiction, taxes, and poverty. The promises of stronger armies or modern schools did not touch their lives. When projects failed, it only confirmed their suspicion that the dynasty was incapable of true change. Trust in reform efforts faded, leaving people cynical and disengaged. Without the support of the population, even the most determined leaders would have struggled. Some reform-minded officials and intellectuals did see the problem clearly. They argued that opium was not only a social curse but also the greatest obstacle to renewal. But their voices were drowned out by the weight of addiction and the resistance of vested interests. Those who profited from the trade, whether foreign merchants or corrupt local officials, had no reason to support change. Those who were addicted themselves lacked the strength to fight. The result was paralysis. The tragedy of this period is that the empire was not entirely blind. Leaders knew that reforms were necessary. They had examples from abroad, especially the rise of Western industrial powers. They understood that China risked falling behind. Yet understanding without action is powerless. The smoke of opium filled the gap between knowledge and practice, leaving reforms trapped as ideas rather than realities. I cannot help but feel that this was one of the cruelest aspects of the crisis, watching potential solutions dissolve before they could ever be tried. As time passed, the gap between China and foreign powers widened. Western nations built factories, railways, and fleets, while China issued decrees that went nowhere. The appearance of reform was maintained through ceremonies and proclamations, but the reality was decay. Foreigners interpreted this as weakness, and they were correct. A state that cannot reform itself cannot defend itself. The paralysis of reform was not just a missed opportunity, it was a step deeper into decline. Without new strength, the empire could not resist foreign demands. Without investment, its armies remained weak. Without education, its bureaucracy remained stagnant. The window of time when change might have been possible closed, leaving China exposed to greater humiliation and loss. The era of reform was meant to revive the empire, but under the shadow of opium, it became another chapter of failure. The combination of weak leadership, drained finances, addicted elites, and exhausted commoners left no room for true renewal. The empire stood still while the world moved forward, and standing still in such a time was as dangerous as marching backward. The smoke that clouded minds and drained treasuries also suffocated the future. Every chance for revival was smothered before it could take shape. The Qing dynasty, trapped in its own weakness, became a prisoner of habit and paralysis. The hope of self-strengthening remained a dream, while reality sank deeper into decay. The Qing government eventually realized that opium was more than just a passing problem, and edicts were issued to ban its use and trade. On paper, the empire took a strong stance, declaring the drug illegal and threatening punishment for those who dealt in it. But paper laws could not compete with reality. Smuggling routes multiplied, merchants grew bolder, and foreign traders increased their shipments with confidence. The ban, instead of stopping the trade, created new opportunities for corruption and profit. Officials tasked with enforcement often became protectors of the very business they were meant to destroy. The system rotted from its roots, leaving the empire unable to control its own markets. It is almost ridiculous to think of a government declaring war on a drug while its own officers were making money from protecting the smugglers. The problem began with the sheer demand. Once addiction had spread across the empire, people sought out opium regardless of its legal status. Banning it did not erase the craving. In fact, it made the trade more profitable. Smugglers charged higher prices, and addicts paid them, draining even more silver from the economy. The black market thrived, growing larger and more organized with each passing year. Entire networks developed, linking coastal ports to inland towns. Caravans carried the drug through mountain passes, along rivers, and across vast plains. Traders were inventive, hiding opium in tea chests, clothing, or grain sacks. For every shipment intercepted, many more slipped through unnoticed. The empire could not police all its borders, and with so many officials compromised, much of the trade flowed unhindered. Foreign merchants understood this dynamic perfectly. They relied on corruption and bribery as much as on ships and cargo. When officials tried to enforce bans, they were often bought off with silver or given gifts of opium. A magistrate who smoked in private was unlikely to punish others for doing the same. In some cases, officials who were publicly responsible for enforcing anti-opium laws were privately among the most enthusiastic users. The contradiction was glaring, but it was ignored in favour of profit and habit. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like police officers tasked with stopping drug trafficking being themselves addicted, bribed, and helping the trade flourish instead of stopping it. The result was a government that looked strong in proclamations but weak in practice. Imperial edicts continued to flow, each declaring new punishments, new inspections, and new promises of enforcement. Yet in towns and villages, the reality was the same. Pipes continued to burn, silver continued to drain, and smugglers continued to profit. The people saw this and lost respect for the state's authority. If the government could not enforce its own laws, what hope was there for justice or order in other matters? The erosion of legitimacy spread, one broken law at a time. In some areas, the law became not a barrier but a tool for profit. Officials pretended to enforce bans by arresting small-time traders while protecting the larger networks that paid them bribes. This created a facade of action while ensuring the main trade continued. The hypocrisy was obvious to anyone watching closely. The empire was not stopping the trade, it was profiting from it. The black market was no longer underground, it was openly woven into the fabric of governance. The failure to control the trade also created violence. Smugglers fought over routes, bribes, and territory. Local communities sometimes resisted them, but without reliable law enforcement, these conflicts spiraled. Banditry and smuggling blurred together, making entire regions unsafe. Instead of stability, the countryside was filled with tension, with addicts demanding supply, smugglers providing it, and officials turning away in exchange for coins or pipes. The inability to enforce the law also weakened the military even further. Soldiers, like officials, were often drawn into the trade, either as protectors of smuggling operations or as users themselves. Garrisons became centres of corruption rather than defence. When troops who should have been stopping opium shipments instead facilitated them, the empire's weakness was plain for all to see. The very men who carried imperial banners were acting as guardians of the black market. For ordinary people, the failure was devastating. Addicts continued to spend what little they had. Families were ruined, communities hollowed out, and yet the state seemed powerless or unwilling to intervene. Parents saw their children fall into addiction. Wives watched husbands waste away, and still the trade grew. The promises of reform and enforcement sounded hollow against the reality of open markets and corrupt officials. I cannot help but think that watching such hypocrisy must have felt like living in a theatre, where actors recited lines about morality while the stage behind them burned. By the time the empire recognized the scale of the crisis, it was too late. The black market had become so large and profitable that no simple ban could stop it. The corruption had spread so deeply that enforcement was nearly impossible. Officials, soldiers, and even local leaders were tied to the trade, either by profit or by addiction. The root of the problem was no longer just the drug itself, but the entire system that allowed it to flourish. This failure to act decisively and honestly meant that the empire sank deeper into dependency. The people were hooked, the officials were corrupted, and the markets were controlled by smugglers and foreigners. The law had no teeth, and the government had no credibility. The stage was set for even greater humiliation, as the weakness of enforcement would soon be exploited by foreign powers who saw clearly that the empire could not control its own territory. The strength of any empire depends not only on its soldiers or its treasury, but also on the minds of its people. For centuries, China had built its bureaucracy and its cultural pride on education. The examination system stood as a ladder through which talent could rise, bringing men from villages into the highest offices of state. Schools and academies were scattered across the land, filled with students memorizing the classics, guided by teachers who saw themselves as guardians of knowledge. But the rise of opium broke this foundation. As addiction spread, classrooms emptied, teachers abandoned their posts, and the promise of learning faded into smoke. It is almost laughable to think that an empire once admired for producing scholars of great wisdom was soon producing exam candidates who carried pipes into study halls. Teachers were among the first casualties. Many who had devoted their lives to scholarship and guiding the next generation found themselves drawn into the habit. At first, they believed opium sharpened thought or calmed the nerves during long nights of study. Soon, it dulled their focus and drained their energy. Schools that had once echoed with recitations grew quiet as instructors lost interest, missed lessons, or abandoned their duties entirely. Without strong teachers, students were left adrift, and the chain of knowledge that had stretched across centuries began to break. The students themselves were no stronger. Many who dreamed of success in the civil service examinations turned to opium to manage the pressure. The exams demanded years of preparation, endless memorization, and great mental endurance. Instead of strengthening themselves through discipline, some students sought relief in smoke. At first, it seemed to ease their stress, but over time, it hollowed out their will. Young men who should have been the rising stars of the empire wasted their best years in haze. They arrived at examination halls distracted, weak, and often too ill to perform. Failure rates rose, and the quality of those who passed declined. The pipeline of talent that had once fed the empire's bureaucracy was poisoned at its source. The decline of education spread beyond exams. Families that once saved every coin to send sons to school found those same coins spent on opium. Fathers who had promised their children a future of study could no longer provide tuition. Mothers who had hoped to see their sons rise through learning now saw them fall into addiction instead. The sacrifice of generations, built on the idea that knowledge would secure stability and honour, was wasted. The dream of advancement through education lost its meaning. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like an entire country where university students relied on hard drugs instead of discipline, and professors no longer bothered to teach because they were lost in